Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and I am here to read. Every week, first we read a piece of classic literature, and then we discuss it, because I have a lot of opinions about everything. So down in the video's description box, you will find a link to an ebook if you would like to follow along, or you can enable captions. And while you're down there in the video description box, there's also source links, links to the author's bio, and also, interestingly enough, there's a link that says subscribe on it that you might want to subscribe while you're down there. This week we are reading The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that, if I asked old Wheeler about him, he would remind him of the infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him as long and tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels, and I noticed he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, whom he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that, if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, then sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm. But all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replies as follows. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. There was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49, or it might be the spring of 50. I don't recollect exactly somehow, though what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to camp, but anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see, if he could get anybody to bet on the other side. And if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, so's he got a bet, he was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He must always come out a winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned but that feller'd offer to bet on it. And if you take any side you please, just as I was telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular, bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about there, and so he was, too, and a good man. If he ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywheres, he'd bet you how long it would take him to get up wherever he was going to, and if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico, but what he would find out there was bound for, and how long he was on the road. Lots of boys here has seen that Smiley, and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He would bet on anything. The dangest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while. It seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he come in and Smiley asked how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that, with the blessing of Providence, she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, "Well, I resk 2.5 she don't anyway." This Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, 'cause of course she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse for all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 start and then pass her underway, but always at the end of the race she'd get excited and desperate-like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs about limber, sometimes in the air and sometimes out to one side amongst the fences and kicking up M-O-R-E dust and raising M-O-R-E racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up the stand about a neck ahead as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a small bull pup that, to look at him, you'd think he wasn't worth a cent, but to sit around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine savage like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bully-rag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, which was the name of that there pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but what he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else, and the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up, and then just all of a sudden he would grab that other dog just by the gent of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge if it was a year. Smiley always come out the winner on that pup till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs because they'd been shot off by a circular saw, and when the thing was all gone far enough, the money was all up, and he come to make a snatch for his pet hold, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed on and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak, and he appeared surprised and looked sort of discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, so he got shucked out bad. He give Smiley a look, as much to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in the fight, and he limped off a piece and laid down and died. Was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, would have made a name for himself if he lived, for the stuff that was in him, and he had a genius. I know it, because he hadn't had no opportunity to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight if he could under them circumstances, if he hadn't no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think about that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Well, this Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He kitched a frog one day and took him home and said he calculated to educate him, so he never done nothing for 3 months but sit in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn too. You give him a little punch behind, the next minute you see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset and might be a couple if he got a good start and come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so much in the matter of catching flies and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything. I believe him. Why, I seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor, Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And faster than you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off in the counter there, flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You'd never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had travelled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in camp he was, come across him with his box and said, "What might it be you've got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot or might be canary maybe, but ain't, only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful, turned around this way and that, and he says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long particular look and gave it back to Smiley and says very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no other points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 you can now jump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute and then says kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And Smiley says, that's all right. If you hold my box for a minute, I'll go get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sit down to wait. So he sit there a good while, thinking to himself. Then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, set him back on the floor. Smiley went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, finally catched a frog and fetched him in and give him to this feller and says, "Now if you're ready, set him alongside of Dan'l with his forepaws just even with Dan'l's, and I'll give the word." And then he says, 1, 2, 3, jump. And him and the feller touched on the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off, but Dan'l give a heave and hissed it up his shoulders, so like a Frenchman, but it wasn't no use. And he couldn't budge, he was planted solid as an anvil, and he couldn't no more stir than he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders, this way at Dan'l, and says, again, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan'l a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Dan'l by the nape of the neck, lifted it up, and says, "Why, blame cats if you don't weigh 5 pounds. And turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took after that fella and never catched him. And here, Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, 'Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't gonna be but a second.' But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced, 'Well, this here Smiley had a yaller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, and only just a short stump like a banana, and—' 'Oh, hang Smiley and his afflicted cow,' I muttered, good-naturedly, and bidding the good gentleman good day, I departed." The end. The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County was Mark Twain's first real published piece. He had published a couple things before that, but this was kind of the story that really pushed him to the forefront and really started to make his name. It was initially published in 1865 in the New York Saturday Press, and initially it was called Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. And then it was rehashed and republished again. This time it was actually called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and it was published in a magazine called California. And then it was again published in 1867 in a compilation of short stories of Mark Twain's called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and Other Sketches. It's also frequently called The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, but I'm not quite sure when it got that title in addition. I'm going to use both of them just because, you know, SEO and the two stories, as far as I can tell, are exactly the same. It's just it got this different title at one point. Even though the whole book is called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. I don't know. Mark Twain had kind of a bananas life. He and his family lived in Missouri on the Mississippi River for a long time, and that's where a lot of his work is kind of centered, is in this Mississippi River area. Mark Twain is kind of one of the figures that you think about when you think about the American regionalist movement. And regionalism kind of took hold around the era of the Civil War. It basically very much centers a particular piece of writing in a location. It's usually a location that's very well known to the writer. So in Mark Twain's case, that's usually in the Mississippi River. Obviously, Calaveras County is not on the Mississippi River. But when he wrote it, Mark Twain actually picked up the thread of the story from a mining camp. He had moved out to California, to San Francisco in particular, to be a part of the gold rush. Because, gold was discovered in them thar hills, and then people went out to try and mine gold. So he was actually a gold miner at the time. This particular piece makes very good use of two things. One of them is regionalism, like we discussed a little bit. And then the other one is voice. And it isn't just a really good example of regionalism because of Simon Wheeler and his particular manner of speech, his slanginess. Obviously, I affected an accent when I was reading it, but if you read the actual text or if you had the captions enabled, the text itself is clearly written with a particular, like that Western rhotic accent in mind. But it isn't just about Simon Wheeler, it's also about the unnamed narrator. For his part, the narrator's clearly implied judgment of Simon Wheeler and his story, it isn't even implied. He straight out says, this guy never smiled, he didn't think it was funny, he didn't change his affect at all, it was so weird. But the narrator clearly is judging Simon Wheeler for this confabulated story about this frog and this man. I find it kind of funny that before we even get to Simon Wheeler at all, I think it's in the first or second paragraph, the narrator actually says, "I don't believe that this gentleman has any idea of the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley," which just primes us to be kind of on the inside of he has no idea who Leonidas Smiley is. And it also kind of shares some similarities with the American folkloric tall tales that were popular in Mark Twain's youth. It doesn't quite have the exaggerated larger than life, I think Paul Bunyan's supposed to be 20 feet tall and he has a blue ox that's his friend. But clearly Jim Smiley is kind of this confabulated, larger-than-life figure, even if it isn't, outlandishly so, right? A lot of Mark Twain's writing just feels very core to, America, as we think of, American folklore. So I really enjoy this one. It kind of feels like down home and homespun and stuff, but at the same time, it's Mark Twain. He is an amazing writer, and he made his career off writing relatable homespun feeling tales. Like this one. This is just kind of a funny kind of story, and we've been reading a lot about death and grieving and more death lately, so I kind of wanted to mix it up a little bit with the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. If you liked this departure from the usual depressing stories we read, make sure you leave a like down below. Or even if you liked it and also like the depressing stuff we usually read, then like it down below. And I hope you'll be back next week for some more classic literature. I'll see y'all next time.